So let me dive into a little bit of the history. Some of you may know this, some of you may not. We're going to go back to the 60s, Houston. A little Hispanic boy drowned in Texas. Uh, it had to do with a gravel pit, large gravel pit for highway construction projects that was not fenced within a minority community. Those gravel pits in other communities were fenced. This particular one wasn't. Then we get to Warren County, 1982. That's this. You can see this picture down here on the bottom, uh, where this was a sanitary landfill, hazardous waste site down in Warren County that was deliberately put in a poor community, a black community. Um, there was outrage over that because of the hazards associated with it. A lot of protests. People, as you can see here, laying in the middle of the street, stopping some of the trucks coming into the facility and so forth. And then you advance to 1988, Kettleman, California. Most of you are probably familiar with Kettleman. This shows us the diagram here, the orange area. That's where Kettleman is, halfway between San Francisco and LA. In an agricultural community, a lot of monolingual Hispanic families, about 40%, if I remember right, are monolingual. And as a result of that, they were putting in a hazardous waste facility and they were expanding it later in the early 90s to an incinerator, hazardous waste incinerator facility. Uh, Both of these cases then resulted in the 1991 First National People of Color Leadership Workshop back here in Washington, D.C. That was really the culmination of bringing a lot of case studies together to talk about concerns with environmental harm being disproportionately shared among minority and disadvantaged communities. The outcome of that, with an executive order from the president, that was promulgated in 1994, action relative to moving federal agencies in a direction of considering the impact to minority disadvantaged communities. It mandates at the federal level that each agency develop a strategy, and the strategy is to address disproportionate high adverse human health and environmental effects on minority and low income populations. Nothing in law at the federal level, by the way, with a couple of tangential statutes like American Disabilities Act, the Civil Rights Act of 64, and some other statutes, there is no provision of law at the federal level that deals with environmental justice. It promotes enforcement of health and environmental authorities, and an equal component to that is the second component: greater public participation from those minority disadvantaged communities. Now, there are two other provisions: improve research, identify differential patterns. The differential pattern of consumption of natural resources has never really gained a lot of interest at the federal level. Some states have initiated work in that, New Jersey, as an example, Oregon. Um, and there hasn't been a lot of federally supported research in this area. There is research being supported, but it's not through a lot of federal grant programs. So the greatest aspect is enforcement and public participation. Now, what do we mean? Here's the definition: the disproportionate high adverse human health, environmental effects of programs, policies, activities, minority, low income. Now, it's interesting. Within about 3 years, the Environmental Protection Agency at the federal level, they were given the administrative responsibility for the oversight of environmental justice in the executive order. They redefined it. They call it the Fair Treatment Isn't that interesting? The fair treatment of people of all races, cultures, income, regardless the development of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. In 2023, the executive, now understand this is going from 94, 95 to 2023. We have no intervening redefinitions except by some states. Talk a little bit about that. But notice the definition change now. Fair treatment, just like we did with the EPA, meaningful involvement, and again, they include race, color, national origin, but they've added tribal affiliate or disabilities. So now disabilities has been brought in under the umbrella of EJ, and I'm going to expand on that a little later in the workshop on human health and the environment. That was just recently. So you can see the definition has kind of evolved a little bit as we've gone forward. Now, EPA's definition is the definition that under your state California code you have adopted. Your state code is a little bit different than the EJ definition by EPA. And you've expanded by talking about the adoption, implementation, and enforcement. So you've expanded on it a little bit, but it's basically the same definition as what EPA has been using. And that's part of your state statute. Now, at the federal level, environmental justice is driven by executive orders. It's not driven by statute. Now, I'm going to get into a distinction of why is that important. I'll talk about why that is important. But we have the first two executive orders that go all the way back to 1994-2000. Notice the gap, a 20-year gap between the last executive order, which really is not an environmental justice executive order, but it relates to EJ, and I'll talk about what it is. And then we have a 20-year gap before we get the next set of executive orders. And now we've got 4 of them between 2021 and 2023. Now, I'm not going to go into elaborate detail on what's in them, but I will explore how this has evolved so you understand what's going on here. However, why do I focus on executive orders? Here's why. Every executive order has this statement at the end of it or something similar to it. This is the one used by the Biden administration. It was the one used by the Clinton administration. It was not used by the Trump administration. They had different language. The administration had a little different language. Notice what it says, though. This order is not intended to and does not create any right or benefit, substantive or procedural, enforceable at law. Now, that's legalese for saying, I can't take you to court for violating an executive order. So how does this work? And this works at the state level as well as the federal level. That's why I'm going to kind of expand on this. You have laws. Your agencies at the state and federal level then develop regulations. Regulations are subject to administrative public review, comment. When they become regulations, they are then codified in either your state regulations or in the federal. In the federal, we call them the Code of Federal Regulations, what we call the CFRs. This is just one example. They have chapters and then they have topic areas. Agencies, state or federal, then develop their own agency guidance, which is not binding. Meaning most agency guidance has not gone through a public comment review process. It's what we call guidance. It's suggested techniques and approaches and how you're going to implement the regulations and the law. It's not binding, okay? Executive orders fall in this camp, all right? They can't trump formal regulations. They can't override a formal regulation. An executive order is, if you're managing, let's say, a supermarket, And the manager comes in, the manager decides they're going to move the produce department to a different part of the office or the store. Well, you can probably do that because there's no regulations, state or federal, that say exactly how that store has to be organized. However, if you did have, let's say, parking lot, let's say the manager decides that they don't want handicap parking. Well, I know by state and federal statute, they can't override that through an executive order, a management provision. So that's where executive orders fit. Judicial decisions, state or federal, they interpret law and evaluate whether the regulations promulgated by a state or federal agency are in conformance with the law. And they'll either say you are or you aren't, or you may be, but you got to add this or do this or modify it in some way. So as we get into this, I'm going to talk about some of the laws, mostly at the state level, regulations at state and federal, and executive orders. In the arena of environmental justice, there is judicial decisions. I'll talk about what those are. We're not going to dive into them, but I'll give you kind of the general umbrella on how those operate. Agency decisions, that's your actual projects. Whether you're complying with the National Environmental Policy Act or you're complying with the California Environmental Quality, that's where you're making individual project decisions that are all subjected to this hierarchy of how this all works. Notice on the federal court review of the EJ claims, when the federal court is intervened, although the executive order does not itself create a right of action, which it doesn't, those analyses are subject to arbitrary and capricious review under the Administrative Procedure Act. Now, what does that mean? All right, state, we'll go to California and the feds. Under law, you've got the California Environmental Quality Act. You in state law also have what is very equivalent to the Administrative Procedure Act. The short for that is when you are doing your CEQA analysis or your federal National Environmental Policy Act, I can't sue you directly under those statutes. In terms of a direct suit, what we call suit provision, what I sue you under are the Administrative Procedure Act, meaning those are provisions of law that tell your state and federal agencies that you have to follow a certain etiquette of analysis to show that you have not been arbitrary and capricious in the way that you have addressed a particular problem. So I don't sue you directly for violation of CEQA or NEPA. I sue you for failure to provide certain administrative analysis requirements. Kind of interesting way in which that's all done. So how does this work then, the overlap? At the federal level, environmental justice is predicated on the Interstate Commerce Clause. Believe it or not, okay? It's based on the Interstate Commerce Clause, particularly as it relates to water and air. Those are interstate commerce federal. That's where the feds have jurisdiction over the state, is anything that involves interstate commerce. The feds come in and can regulate it. And they also have authority to maintain and protect personal rights, the right of assembly, as an example, practice of religion. All of those are personal rights. Environmental justice, however, doesn't fall very well under either of these federal. EJ is done through executive orders, and to the extent those executive orders have been turned into regulation, like for Department of Transportation, there are regulations which are binding, but executive orders are not binding. Now, in the state side, states have authority over property use, primarily. There are other provisions as well, and any delegated authorities from the feds. So what's a delegated authority? Even though EPA has authority over clean air, clean water, they delegate the actual administration and management of those statutes to the state. The state then has primary responsibility for administering clean air and clean water. The state can, in some cases, expand on that. In some cases, they can't. The difference with environmental justice is a number of states, and I'll show you who they are, have statutes, actual law that mandates provisions of environmental justice. The state of California is one of those. You actually have state statutes. That's not true at the federal level, but it is true at the state. And you have regulations and executive orders also. Now, the way you comply with state and federal, particularly for environmental justice, is through an analysis process. At the federal level, it's through the National Environmental Policy Act, because we have no federal statute that mandates environmental justice. At the state level, you do that through your CEQA process. Oftentimes, NEPA and CEQA for California, they get merged together. When you've got joint projects that you're doing with the feds and the state, by your state CEQA statute, you are able to blend those two into one analysis. All right. So that's where they overlap, is in this middle area, that you can have joint federal and state projects where you've got the federal agencies got to comply with the environmental justice provisions of the federal executive orders, but you at the state not only have to comply with your federal, but you also have to comply with your statutes and other regulations for environmental justice. So there's a little bit of overlap, and I'm not going to fly spec all that, but just do appreciate that when you're doing projects that involve environmental justice considerations, you may have both federal and state provisions you got to deal with. In some cases, you've only got state. In other cases, you may only be dealing with federal. There is another statute, Civil Rights Act of 1964. A lot of misperceptions about EJ, environmental justice, being directly fitting under the Civil Rights Act. Now, don't be so quick to assume that everything you do in environmental justice falls squarely under the Civil Rights Act. Now, the Civil Rights Act talks about prohibiting discrimination based on race, color, national origin, programs and activities, financial assistance. There is an overlap. Civil Rights Act controls direct discrimination based on race, color, and national origin. It does not address low income, although in a lot of cases there's an overlap. Low income is an environmental justice contrivance. It's not a part of the Civil Rights Act. So minority overlapping with low income is where you get the executive, the EJ overlap, that EJ covers both. And the Civil Rights Act really is very narrow. It has to do with hiring decisions, promoting and work environment, pay and fringe benefits, harassment in the workplace. It's overt kind of action against an individual or a group, mostly related to employment and work environments, but not entirely. So it's much more narrow. I do have in your materials where they're similar and where they're different. Both are non-discrimination, deal with minority, both constitutional guarantees, both address involvement. The main difference is this last point down here on the far right. Environmental justice mandates a process, while Title VI prevents discrimination, outright discrimination. So EJ is more about, did an agency look at impacts to minority disadvantaged communities, and have they evaluated and attempted to correct it? Following that, 6 years later, was another executive order that recognized that many minority communities have limited English proficiency. That was then mandated by the executive order in 2000 that deals with access to services and information for communities with limited English proficiency. Now, why is this important? This is really important in that you have a responsibility to provide information to them in a way that they can understand it. So, as you're doing your EJ analysis, take this into consideration that you may have to translate some of your proposals into a language other than English in order for those minority communities to be able to influence and interact with you. And I'm not going to go too far with this, but an offshoot of all this is part of the global environment with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and what we call the Fifth Assessment Report. That recently, particularly by the Biden administration, there are efforts to look at the implications of climate change policy and its implication to minority and disadvantaged communities. Now, normally you think about your action and what your action is going to do or can do to these communities. But the development nowadays is what also are the implications of climate change to those minority disadvantaged communities, coupled with the incremental effects of your action. This has been developed over probably the last 4 years, where this is starting to come to a greater attention of state, particularly California, Florida, Louisiana, that this is becoming a major component of the environmental justice analysis. So there was a gap, as I said, once you get the initial executive order and the English proficiency, then you got a 20-year gap where the Biden administration put a real premium on agencies moving more aggressively with addressing disproportionate impact to these minority disadvantaged communities. So the first executive order, one of the first, was on January 27th. There was actually one on January 21st. We'll get to that later. They're taking environmental justice and expanding the scope. Notice what the new policy is proposing: to secure an equitable economic future. We're no longer talking about public health and safety from environmental exposures to smog, lead, pesticides, and those kinds of pollutants. Now we're talking about equitable economic opportunities. Therefore, it's the policy of this administration to secure environmental justice and spur economic opportunities. This administration is blurring the distinction between environmental justice, economic justice, and social justice. I'm going to expand on that. So if you're not familiar with those terms, I'm going to explore that because it has implications to where California is going as well. They also created a new office out of the White House, Environmental Justice Interagency Council, which actually reports to the Council on Environmental Quality. I actually worked at CEQ my last year of federal service. I left the Forest Service and went over and worked at the White House for CEQ, so I'm very familiar with kind of that office and how it operates and what they do. But they set out recommendations to update the original executive order. They were to expand on what we call EJ Screen. EJ Screen is a software package. It's a geospatial software package like Cal EnviroScreen. We'll talk about that later, where you can go in and pull up a map, and I'll show you what it looks like, and you can narrow in on any particular census block to determine whether or not that census block is composed of minorities or disadvantaged communities. But they are expanding EJ Screen with an economic justice screening tool. So environmental justice now is moving into economic justice. That then led to what we call the Justice 40 initiative, which, by the way, you in California also have a very similar initiative by state statute. But the Justice 40 initiative was calling for federal agencies to provide 40% of all overall benefits to disadvantaged communities. Some people threw up their hands and screamed and yelled and said, wait a minute, you can't do that. Well, you're right. Congress determines where your funds are going to go. A federal agency doesn't have the discretion to decide where monies necessarily are going to be spent. The Justice 40 initiative is a fairly small pot of money where agencies do have the discretion to decide where monies will go. That 40% of those discretionary monies are to flow to disadvantaged communities. So it's not a large pot of money, but nevertheless, it is an initiative that is aimed at providing that economic opportunity. So where are we with minority disadvantaged communities? You can see from the 2010 census versus the 2021 census, distribution of minority communities' overall population hadn't shifted a lot. As an example, the Asian community was 4.8 in 2010, is now 5.9. Black community, non-Hispanic, 12.3. Now it's 12.6. You get the idea. When you look at the nation as a whole, not a lot of shifts. So why is this an issue nowadays? It has to do with where those communities are, their distribution geographically. And so I can take, if I look at race and ethnic groups at a large national scale, I don't think this surprises any of you with where a lot of these groups are, centered around the nation. As you hone in on smaller and smaller areas, it becomes much more apparent how that distribution is dealt with. Most of the work that I have done has been with Native American communities. You get a general idea kind of word. I don't think this surprises any of you. Look, California, large Asian community up in the southern Frisco Bay area, which we'll talk about later. And then you got a lot of Hispanic through that agricultural San Joaquin Valley area. However, when you look at income distribution, which is the other half of EJ, you've got the minority communities, and then on the other side is the low income. You kind of see the distribution here. That's distributed a lot differently than minorities. The White House Environmental Justice Council, I talked about that earlier. People had expectations that they were going to come out with some really definitive guidance on where environmental justice ought to be headed in the future. Put out a report, 185 recommendations. I was unimpressed, to say the least. They talk about the screening tool, how it's going to be used. They define definitions, which I'm going to spend some time on so you understand how diverse definitions are. This is what the Council of Environmental Justice is. Treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless race, color, national origin, income. Okay, fine. Regarding human health and the environment, that's a little different than where the Biden administration is taking it. What is a EJ community? Significant representation of persons of color, low income, indigenous persons, or members of tribal nations, where such persons experience risk of higher or more adverse human health and environment. Well, What is significant representation? How do we define that? And what do you mean by adverse? Those aren't defined. Can't give you a bright line test. So the council decided they would try to clarify that. Low income communities, any census block with 30% or more of the population, or less than 80% of the median national income, family income, or 200% of the federal poverty line. Well, now wait a minute. Which is it? Give me a criteria that I can go to a census block, or I can block out some geographical area, and I can take a look at what percent of the population in that group is below the poverty level, or is below 200% of the poverty level, or median income. But tell me what the criteria is so I have a bright line test. Graphically, I'm going to show you where we are. Now, the reason I'm doing this is to display when you get into doing environmental justice, defining whether or not your community or census block you're working with is considered minority or disadvantaged is a judgment call. All right? It's a judgment call. So when I take a look at the US population in terms of income level, I'll use income for this example. You can notice I've got about 9% here is under 15,000. This is in 2021 dollars. Then it goes up to 15 to 24,000 and so forth. You can kind of see the distribution. The criteria that are used to define low income, Hellman Huth Surface's poverty line, that's this red line right here. 200% of the poverty line is this line. So what I do, I just take this line, multiply it by 2, and I get this line. Or 80% of the median income, household income. When you dissect all of the guidance, it's somewhere in between here. Well, that's quite a range. That is a huge range. In the end, which I'll show you, it's actually between these two lines, between 200% poverty line and 80% median income. But that leaves question, what percentage of people in that census block are within this band? Is it 20%, 30%, 50%? That's of equal importance. And again, is not well defined. We'll come back to that later. They talk about federal agencies' responsibilities. And again, very quickly, you got a plan for public participation. You have to have a strategy for accomplishing EJ. You have to coordinate. Lots of requirements that federal agencies have to comply with. My personal opinion, this is from a personal perspective, I'm less concerned about how I identify these minority communities and where the census blocks are and all that. I'm more concerned with how I engage those communities to give them an opportunity to influence state and federal decision making. Under the limited English proficiency executive order, notice each federal and state agency must provide translation and interpretation of public documents as appropriate for the affected population. So if you've got a community, and it may be a small area, you have the responsibility to provide them documents translated into a language that they can read and understand and engage with you. A point I want to make as we go, I characterize justice with 4 areas of what I call justice: environmental justice, economic justice, social justice, political justice, and legal justice. Now, those are my definitions. I distinguish them very differently. Do they overlap? Yep, sure do. Policies that you're going to develop, however, I would argue it's much easier for you to put them in one of these 5 divisions. And the reason for that is because the way you solve EJ is focused differently than how I solve economic, and it may be different than how I solve social. I'm going to discuss the differences, but then I'm going to talk about how you overcome those. So, environmental justice. Let me characterize what do I mean by environmental justice? Is your facility, activity, or project located in proximity to an EJ community? That's first thing is location. Does that location lead to an increased exposure level from other communities? Meaning they're disproportionately being exposed to something because the location. Does that exposure result in human health implications? Okay, so you can see my approach to EJ is much more narrow than what a lot of practitioners might indicate. This is really aimed at public health and safety due to environmental exposures. That to me is environmental justice. It's very narrow. In doing that, whether I'm dealing with environmental justice, social justice, or economic justice, to get what I call agreement with my EJ community, there are 3 components that you focus on: procedural justice, perception of justice or legitimacy, distributive justice or well being. People say, well, Ray, what do you mean by that? All right. When you're doing environmental work, complying with CEQA, complying with NEPA, and you're trying to really show your engagement with these EJ communities, here's how it works. How will you be heard? Did you give the EJ community an opportunity to weigh in? And we're going to go into a lot more detail on this afternoon, but did you give them an opportunity? That's process. Perception or legitimacy. Did you demonstrate that you heard what they said? Have you communicated to them that we gave you an opportunity? Here's what we heard from you. Here's what your concerns are and how to solve distributive justice. And here's what we're going to do about it. We're going to institute these kinds of policies or these procedures, or we're going to mitigate this by doing these kinds of activities. If you're going to get agreement, what I call agreement on justice by your EJ communities, you got to do all 3 of these. We'll talk about how you do that. That's in the next hour and a half. Okay. So, how will they be heard? Did you give them an opportunity for that to happen? What forms did you use and how did you do it? Did you demonstrate to them that you listened to them? Here's what we heard from you. Is this correct? And here's what we're going to do about it. If you're going to be successful with your environmental justice initiatives, you got to do all 3 of these. We'll talk about how you do that, but that's kind of my overall philosophy for how EJ works, is really aimed on this principle of agreement on justice. Oh, yeah, Isabel? Yes. How did you know that? How did you know that? You must work with that community. Yeah, that's exactly right. Not many people know that small community. So, to kind of wrap up here with this morning's kind of overview before we jump into how you do this, how do you procedurally build environmental justice into your policies and decision making? There are lots of explanations for why we have environmental injustice. Notice I use the term injustice versus justice. These are some of the ones you hear talked about: scientific rationale, driven by technical criteria, geology. The reason we located this facility here is because of geologic processes or availability of water or minerals, availability of minerals, whatever. It's science rationale. Market, economics. We located this facility here because the shipping market is located near this particular area, or the real estate values are very low here and therefore it's cheap property and therefore it's based on market rationale. Neighborhood transition. Example of that is Denver Airport. I don't know if any of you remember Stapleton Airport back in the 19 probably 80s. Stapleton Airport was just, what would it be, east of Denver. And back in the 1920s, when airports were the new thing for the wealthy, there were a lot of wealthy development around Stapleton Airport because the wealth would allow them to go to the airport, hop on an airplane, and fly to Los Angeles or whatever. Well, over time, you get jet engines coming in. Flights are flying at 11, 12, 1 o'clock in the morning. You got 20 times more flights than you had before. People didn't like all that disruption. There was neighborhood transition. The wealthy moved out of that area near Stapleton Airport and moved elsewhere. Well, real estate values declined. There was what we call neighborhood transition. Political power. Those with money and political influence make the decisions. I'll show you a couple of those decisions in our case studies this afternoon. Or there is intentional discrimination. All of these have played a role depending on the case that you're looking at. They all have played a role depending on where you are. The movement, the EJ movement, it's an interesting movement. If you study the history of the movement, there are a lot of different independent movements that came together to really make the EJ movement the prominent movement that it is today. And they all contribute different aspects, civil rights movement, empowerment through action, anti-toxic movement had to do with national networks, mostly academia connections. Certainly, academia, objective and credible science was brought to the table. Native American struggle with philosophy and self determination, labor movement, all of these have come together to make the EJ movement a very prominent and recognized political movement within the United States. The way I show it's kind of this river metaphor that each of these kind of create a different stem of this river that leads to the environmental justice movement. Understanding the history of how this came about is kind of fascinating in terms of how each of these brought a component part to the environmental justice movement, which we're not going to spend any time on. I already talked about the Kettleman. This is probably the seminal case of EJ that really brought this to a head with the proposed hazardous waste and incineration site right in the middle of this agricultural community. It was interesting how that all came about. The arguments were, well, we need one central location to handle all of the hazardous waste coming out of San Francisco and Los Angeles. So let's put it halfway in between. Well, that really wasn't why they put it there, but that was the argument that was made. Uh, I could have easily argued, well, no, you put one material, one hazardous waste site in San Francisco, put another one down in Los Angeles, San Diego, and deal with it there where all the pollution's coming from. Don't put it out in the middle of this EJ community just because you all don't want that incinerator in your local community.